The Art and Science of Wealth podcast, having an impact, leaving a legacy.
Welcome, folks. This is a bit of a special edition of The Art and Science of Wealth. My co-host, Steffi, for reasons we don't know yet, is unavailable. But we have such a really wonderful, experienced guest who's hard to nail down and find time in his busy schedule. So we wanted to go ahead and proceed and just capture the wisdom of Chad down for posterity's sake. And so it'll just be me, but it's largely going to be just extracting the wisdom that Chad has to share from his really remarkable journey in dealing with social change. For those that's your first time, we always do like to offer context that the goal of the Art and Science of Wealth, and Stephanie and I both share this, in our brief relationship that we've had, we just clicked in that we both have really an interesting network of friends and experts in the field of wealth, the art and science of wealth. And we wanted to just capture and memorialize the insights that both from our own professional experiences, both Steffi and I, but also our network of contacts and friends, to really capture almost as a library, the insights that to cut through the noise that's out there. There's a lot of people that have jumped on the family office bandwagon or wealth management or philanthropy or whatever the topic might be, but they're largely wrapping themselves, they're almost wolves in sheep's clothing, if you will. And there's a lot of noise, largely noise to create some catalyzing fear or urgency or FOMO, so they can sell you what they're trying to sell you. And you won't hear Steffi and I talk about what we're doing, and we like to not talk very much on these. We do have remarkable guests that we just want to extract their wisdom while they're willing to give us their time. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest, Chad. And again, I know I've Thevenot, correct?
Thevenot.
Well, I'm getting closer.
Yeah, that was closer.
Chad's current role is with a new university going into Austin, University of Austin. But he has a remarkable background, and I will just hand it over to Chad, if you would, as we've discussed in prep, just kind of talk about your journey and your insights. And we're just going to leave this really free form.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me on. It's interesting that it's the art and science of wealth, because wealth is something that I don't really know much about. This is as somebody who's spent their entire career in the nonprofit sector. Money was never sort of front and center for me. And I spent my career very idealistically so far, and probably will for the balance of my career. But I have, given my career in the nonprofit sector, I've been on both sides of, for example, the grant giving and grant asking, or the fundraising equation, if you will. I ran a grant giving fund for 3 years for marijuana policy reform. This was 20 years ago. So in fact, it was really the first time that marijuana policy was moving from being kind of a joke, frankly, to something that was serious. It was a serious policy question. And it's interesting because my own interest in marijuana was zero. Didn't smoke it, not interested in the culture, nothing. But I was interested in the problem around marijuana policy, and that's how I got involved. And so I ran a grant giving program for many years, and so I was on that side of the equation, working with a major philanthropist in that case. And then, of course, now as a fundraiser, I'm working with wealthy folks all the time. And many of them are in that stage of their careers and their lives where they're thinking very actively about their philanthropy, and they're thinking very actively about their legacy, which is what I think is relevant to your audience. And so I do spend a lot of time around these folks, and I spend a lot of time around the kind of idealism of, like, how do we, whether we're philanthropists or we're activists or artists or whoever, how do we change the world, right? How do we make the world a better place? And look, if you've managed to accumulate a lot of wealth and you have the ability to help make that kind of impact, to bring resources to the table, that's an incredible opportunity, right? That's an opportunity that the vast majority of people just don't have. They might have it with their own talents or with their activism or whatever, but they're not going to have it necessarily from the point of view of having a lot of resources. So, it's a very special thing, and it's very important. And So I think I can offer some perspectives in terms of what I've seen, both from a fund giving as well as a fundraising capacity, which I've been in the nonprofit sector since the beginning of my career, so that's almost 30 years now. Um, and I spent a good chunk of my intellectual life, including graduate school, thinking about and studying and researching and reading about social change. How does change happen in society, and what kind of mechanisms do we have? What kind of buttons can we press or not? And
Mm,
unfortunately, a lot of the buttons that we think we can press, I think we can't. So
mm.
there's a lot of stuff that I think folks believe that they can have an impact with, or that they can be part of their legacy, but aren't actually in our control. And we can talk about that. But of course, many things we not everything's outside of our control. There's some things within our control, and that's where those kind of resources can be applied, intelligently to try to make a difference.
Well, we've got so much to talk about, and that one thread, and I know there's a lot more to your personal journey that I do want to get into in the music area in particular, Chad, because you're far
Yeah.
more interesting than just that, and that alone is interesting. But one of our prior guests, Seth Morton, he's really a real thoughtful guy, PhD in systems design and classics. I mean, really, really bright fella. We pressed him on the difference between wealth and riches. And I would say you are, by his definition, already wealthy. And I think that's a really important distinction, and something you need to understand is that the things that you've worked on and cared about, and the impact you've had, and when you look yourself in the mirror, I know you realize you have been fighting a very good fight for all the right reasons, and you're making a difference. And that is wealth by Seth's definition. So I just want to put a pin in that, because riches is one thing, and even the folks with big piles of money, as many of our other guests have several of them. We haven't had many yet. We've got several guests have spoken. A lot of wealth can be somewhat random or luck. And to have wealth, riches, right? Lots of numbers on your balance sheet. And that is a pursuit that is out of your control. So to use the point you were just making, but being wealthy is entirely in your control, because it doesn't have to do with money.
Right.
And that's a really important topic.
Yeah, I'm glad you're taking a broader definition of it. I mean, outside of literal money, like bank account, I consider myself very wealthy, and I was very intentional about that approach from the very beginning of my career. I mean, I can tell you unequivocally, the most important thing going into my adulthood was my wife, and I always had a policy that I would put her first, and no matter what, and that was the most important thing to me, and that if I did that, everything else would work out. And in fact, that's exactly what happened.
And that's exactly what happened.
So I'm lucky to have an incredibly strong marriage, a very long marriage, and then built on top of that marriage are 3 kids and my wife's business, and our shared home, and so all of these things get built on it that are valuable, but they're not literally bank accounts. And that's fine. It's interesting. I mean, a lot of people who don't pursue money as a kind of a main motivator might be disparaging about money or cynical about it. And I'm not cynical or disparaging about it at all. I think it's awesome. I think it's incredible.
It is.
And I have a lot of admiration for people who have been successful financially, because my overwhelming experience is that they've done amazing things. They've made the world a better place. That was just not the role for me.
Right.
That was not where I thought I could make the biggest difference. It's also interesting because I went to business school.
Yeah.
I went to the University of Texas at Austin. And so, I was sort of, from a pathway standpoint, I was primed to be, this young person who could go into business and potentially make a lot of money. And on one hand, I was not disparaging of that at all. On the other hand, I just kind of came to a realization for me that I didn't think that was where I was going to really thrive.
Yep. I certainly have similar shared experiences as you. I have made a lot of money, but I learned early on in my own life, I didn't do it for the money. That was just an outcropping.
Yeah.
And the same is true for you. It's just timing for you. I have no doubts that you will have the economic resources that you would like to have the life for your wife and your family that you deserve. I really don't. There's a law of nature here.
Yeah,
And
well,
it will happen.
I can't complain. I mean, even in the nonprofit sector, if you do it long enough, and there are opportunities. I mean, none of it's going to make you like ultra high net worth or whatever, but you can live a comfortable life. That's kind of when I felt like I had made it. Maybe that's my definition of wealth. Um, I remember acutely my 10-year reunion. So I would have been 28. And the internet was, around, but people were still mailing things. So I get in the mail um, a little booklet of all of the graduates from my high school. And I grew up in Louisiana, and I went to high school in Louisiana, and Louisiana had terrible education then. So there weren't a lot, and my family was, I grew up relatively poor, at least at the beginning of my childhood. So I was in public schools, and I was fortunate enough to get into a magnet school, a public magnet school that was a very good school for a high school, and it's focused on the performing arts. And look, and if I hadn't gone to that school, who knows where I'd be. Um, but so I'm in this school, which is arguably probably the best public high school in the state of Louisiana, and it's not that big. Maybe I don't remember, but I'm guessing there were 600 or 800 kids total. So maybe 150 to 200 in my graduating class. So everybody kind of knew each other, and these were the top kids. These are some of the smartest, most creative kids in Baton Rouge, where I grew up. So all of them, when they graduated, they went to medical school, they went to law school, they went to some Ivy Leagues. I went off to the University of Texas. And so when I'm looking at this mailing, I got 10 years, for the 10-year reunion, it was everybody's name and then like what they had done, like their affiliation. And somebody worked for Sotheby's, and it was just incredible.
Yeah.
And I was working nonprofit and I got my career started late too. So I just started my career when I was 28. And I was working in a nonprofit, very low salary, at the beginning of all this. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, oh my God, maybe I made a mistake, because, I mean, you can't help yourself. You judge yourself against your peers to some degree. And I did to some degree. And I was looking at it and being like, wow, people are doing some amazing things, and they're probably living a lot more comfortably than I was living, just really scrounging with my wife in DC at that time. And so, it was on my mind. Well, 10 years later, on my 20-year anniversary, so now I'm 38, all this was done online, and they publish it. And by this time, I was the head of a nonprofit, executive director of a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. And, I had a decent salary, and I had a professional salary, and I was doing the stuff I loved, and I love my wife, and we have 3 kids, and I'm looking at what everybody's doing, and I'm also talking to them more because there's, people are on Facebook and so on. And a lot of the people, they didn't look great. They didn't sound great.
They weren't happy.
They weren't happy. Exactly.
They weren't happy.
These are good people too, but they weren't happy. And I just remember thinking like, wow, I think I dodged a bullet here. I think I made the right decision. And not everybody, but it was just one of those things where it's like, hey, maybe it was worth trying to pursue a career of meaning that really, for me, was highly idealistic. It was not practical at all. I probably had the least practical career of anybody I know.
But your success, and that's what matters.
Yeah, it took a little time. It was slow. There wasn't a beaten path, so I didn't know what the path was. So I had to kind of make it up as I went. You don't start your career in what was functionally drug legalization, what drug policy reform, which is how I started my career. You don't start that and think that that's a good decision, a practically good decision. Yeah, I knew. I mean, I wasn't stupid. I knew that was probably professionally not a good decision.
Right.
That it might hurt me, but I didn't care. I was fascinated with what was happening in the drug war at the time, and I thought we could do a lot better. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the work quite a bit. When I got my second job, my second stage of my career, when I was being recruited basically for this to be in a leadership role, not only did the work that I did in drug policy reform not hurt me, but it actually helped. All of the people hiring me thought I had street cred. They were like, "Oh, you were in the trenches when it mattered early on, before it was cool. You took this risk with your career." They thought it was amazing. They were treating me like royalty, and I remember thinking like, "Wow, that is not the outcome I expected."
Let's just say you have very good instincts at worst, and at best, there's a undercurrent of opportunistic planning that you may or may not consciously make those choices, but you've had landed in too many quality places for that not to be. It's not an accident, buddy.
Yeah, look, I haven't had a strong sense of planning, if you will, for my career. It's been mostly serendipity, but I have been very discriminating about like the kind of organizations I would work with, and particularly who I would work with. So it wasn't going to just be anybody. So even like when I was working in marijuana policy reform, and it was kind of this joke, because people would make jokes about it all the time. I mean, I knew, at least in my heart, I was working with really quality people who had integrity, and we were doing the right thing. And we sort of professionalized marijuana policy reform.
Nice.
Very much so at that time. And so, it was the right call. So, I trust that now. Of course, I've been around long enough where I know it's going to work out. So I trust my instincts to take a chance. I mean, with the university that I'm helping to launch right now, I was the third person on board very early on, like in the first few weeks. And so you don't know if it's going to work out or not, and you can't sit there and say, "Oh, if this happens, I'm going to somehow parlay it up into this other career or something." That's all a fantasy. You just have to, you look at it and you kind of go, is this worth doing? I have a kind of a measure for myself, which is, is what I'm doing unequivocally good? So, like, I have to believe that it's unequivocally good, like that I don't see where there's negatives. I mean, there probably are some negatives in there, but I don't see it, because to me, it's just transparently, it's a good thing. All things are negative. You can drink too much water and kill yourself, but so all things have some downsides. But I have to have this strong sense of like, this is obviously and unequivocally good, and so I can do this without having to sit there and worry about whether I'm doing the wrong thing, or whether this is probably going to hurt a lot of people somehow inadvertently down the road. I'm super sensitive about that. It's like, I really don't want to invest my life and my time doing things that could negatively impact people down the road.
You have principles.
Yeah, I mean, well, and I have a view of how that applies in the real world, so I try not to have it just be an abstraction. Very recently, my son, who is just now applying to programs for astronautical engineering to go to college, he's also taken a strong interest in nuclear power, nuclear engineering, and so he's exposed me to some issues around nuclear power and so on. And it's one of the few examples that I could give you right now where it's like, I look at something and I kind of go, wait, so there's all this need for clean energy, there's all this, concern around climate change and so on. And here's something that's right in front of us, an answer that seems to offer so much possibility, and we don't seem to be taking it that seriously.
What are we missing? Yeah.
Right. And so it's an example for me of something that I think would be unequivocally good, even though obviously there's some risk around nuclear energy and nuclear power. But in terms of that is the kind of thing that I could sign up for and not feel like I'm making any compromises.
Yeah. Chad, I always do enjoy talking to you, because I always learn something new every time, and something that makes you just even more interesting. I would like to put a pin on your career right now and actually backtrack, because you talked about UT, but you left out an important part of how you landed at UT.
Yeah.
and why you ended up at UT, because you didn't start there. Why don't you backtrack a little bit about this? And was it from the this magnet school where you started playing music, or were you doing
Yeah.
it before that?
Yeah. No, it was the magnet school. Look, the magnet school changed my life. You know, I grew as a kid, as a young kid in Baton Rouge in Louisiana, where I was born and raised. The only thing I cared about at all, you know,
Basketball.
was basketball. I loved it, and I was, you know, everybody was a Pete Maravich fan. He was a big figure in Baton Rouge, and that's all I thought about up until, you know, I started high school. And then when I did start high school and I got into this good school, because you have to apply to get in and so on, and I barely got in. I got in like a week prior to it starting. Um, that high school, by chance, happened to be focused on the performing arts. It was called something like Baton Rouge High School for the Performing Arts or Magnet School for the Performing Arts. So it had an explicit focus,
Mm-hmm.
which also means it didn't have major athletics, no basketball, no football, no baseball.
Oh
It had things
wow.
like it had fencing and gymnastics and golf, but and so it wasn't a sports culture, and it wasn't about athletes, although we had some PE related stuff, you know. And so you had to focus on the arts. Well, that worked out pretty well because I'd been a lifelong sort of fanatic about rock music. I just loved it. I loved it from, you know, from when I can remember. Um, Now, I didn't play music. I didn't study music. I didn't know an instrument. But when I arrived as a freshman, I started getting more curious, started taking music classes in school and stuff like that. And within a year or so, um, focused on voice and learning guitar, started writing songs, and then sort of fell in love with songwriting.
Mm-hmm.
It's the first time I remember like just wanting to do something like at a spiritual level.
Yeah.
Like I just loved it, and all these songwriters that I'd grown up with, all of a sudden I was imagining like, well, maybe I could do something like that, and it felt real for, you know, for the
Wow.
first time. Um, so a couple buddies of mine and I started a band. I think it was roughly at the beginning of our sophomore year. We went and we made a 2 song demo, which back then you got to remember all this is way pre-internet. This is like 1984. So as well, you know, there's when everything's analog, right? So we cut this demo in a guy's like this dude's like attic. He had like this attic sort of loft space with this 8-track recorder,
Mm.
and we cut a demo in the space. That's all I remember about it. It was
Yeah.
2 songs. One of the and I had my hands in both songs as a co-writer. And we show up in we get the final product and we're pretty happy with it. And so we go down to LSU to the LSU campus, Louisiana State University, and go to KLSU, the local, you know, college radio station. And we just go walk in and we just pitch whatever college kids happen to be operating at that moment. And they found us completely endearing. So they were fascinated. Like, here are these punk looking kids who show up with this tape, and they were like, sure, you know, we'll put on the air.
It's a
And back
college
then,
station. Why not?
right. So back then, they had to take it and put it on this thing called a cart, which was like an 8-track, and
Oh,
you know and so they were like, you know, well, I think we were calling them or something and saying, well, when are you going to play it? And they said, you know, we'll play it tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So we get a jam box at school, and we're waiting for 2 o'clock to roll around, get a bunch of our friends, you know, and everybody's kind of fascinated, and we're waiting for it to play.
oh,
And the song comes on the radio, you know, for the first time ever. You know, and that was that was the end of it.
you're done.
I was done for life.
I'm
You
done.
know, that was the thing that I was just like, holy crap, this is something I want to do.
That's real. That
Yeah,
may
it
make
was
it even more real. Yeah.
yeah. And so, you know, long story short, I stayed with that band of guys roughly. We kind of changed configurations a little bit, but by the time I started college and I was 19, I guess, we had a manager by that point, and we were playing out a fair amount. We were doing pretty well. Certainly people knew who we were and they knew who I was. And we got invited to play this brand new festival. It was on its second year in this podunk little festival in a cow town called Austin.
Yeah.
And of course the festival was South by Southwest. I'd never been to Austin. We'd played in other cities. We played in Lafayette, New Orleans, and so on, but we hadn't played Texas for sure.
Yeah.
So we show up in Austin for this showcase when I think by that time, I think I just turned 20. I was a sophomore, and and Austin, like we're four kids basically
Yeah.
showing up in Austin to play the showcase. Showcase went okay, but nothing came out of it. But it absolutely sold me on the idea of Austin. Um, I was completely enamored with it. There was a music scene. It was cool. It was inexpensive. I mean, it's nothing like it is today. I mean, Austin's fine today, but it's just a different city.
Yeah.
Back then, it was very gritty. I mean, very gritty. It is nothing like it is today. And so I went back home and I told my parents, um, I'd like to transfer to the University of Texas. If I get in, are you guys willing to pay out of state tuition? Which back then actually wasn't terrible.
Yeah.
And they were like, if you can get in, then we'll pay for it. So fortunately, I was a good student, so I got in, and that sealed the deal. So I moved at the end of my sophomore year. I moved over into Austin and just kind of started my life as an adult. I suppose it was the first time I was kind of away from home, and that started me on this journey that I feel like I'm still on today, because everything happened in those first couple of years in Austin in terms of meeting my wife and getting involved with ideas. You know, Austin back then in the early 1990s had a very big scene around the community television on ACTV. I don't know if I ever told you this,
Mm.
but I got involved pretty early on my time there with ACTV, and that really started my interest in ideas.
Mm.
I wasn't really an ideas kind of kid, actually. I mean, I was in the business school at UT. I was very practical.
Yeah.
And I liked the business school, frankly. I was the only kid like me in the business school. Like my buddy and my buddy and I, we were the only ones. The kid, the business school was pretty conventional kids, and then there was me,
There's the
with
rocker. Yeah.
my hair down to about my ass.
Oh, really?
I was very long and straight.
Oh, do you have any
Um,
pictures handy?
yeah, somewhere there are some pictures rolling around. Uh, Tired and kind of out of it half the time because I'd played, I was staying up the night before playing, so I was sleeping in class. I wasn't a particularly attentive student. Um, and the rest of the kids thought I was a freak.
Yeah.
I know they did. But the thing is, I made really good grades, and so they would invite me to their study groups and stuff. Um, but I was definitely not. I was a fish out, I was definitely a fish out of water at the UT Business School. Anyway,
Well, thank you for that. Did your band stay together after you moved to UT?
Briefly, we stayed together for about a year.
Okay.
Uh, Split off. I went and did my own thing. A couple of them went and did their own thing. They had some moderate success. I didn't have much success in Austin at that point. I mean, I had some. I made an album there. I made my first album when I was 23. Right as I was graduating, I made a full length record with the band that I had at the time.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't do, I mean, it didn't do anything particularly spectacular. And then I moved to DC a couple of years later, and shortly after I moved to DC, I made a second record, and that actually did pretty well. And that's a whole other story.
Well, and I know you and I've talked about you maybe thinking about a music related podcast.
Yeah.
And can you talk just briefly about what you're hoping to accomplish there, or what's the sort of theme or thesis of the podcast itself?
Um, I think it has to do with my age in some respects. Because, it's kind of like social change. It really helps if you have decades to look back on.
Mm-hmm.
The social change is a slow process, or it should be. There's two kinds of change. I mean, now I'm going to meander a little bit, but in social change, there's really two kinds of change. There's what you would kind of call an evolutionary kind of change, a social evolution, which is very much what we've largely experienced in the United States. So sometimes it kind of comes to a head like it did in the 60s, and there's some violence or whatnot, but it's still sort of incremental change over time, which is strongly preferred. Because the other kind of change, of course, is revolutionary change. where it's happening at once. And that's, of course, people dying and property being destroyed and trust being broken and so on. And it's devastating.
Systems being torn down so new ones can grow in their place. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So yes, you might get some of the change you want, but it's at a heavy, heavy, heavy cost.
Yeah.
So I'm a big fan of, I'm very comfortable with change. I've spent my whole career in social change, but I'm not a big fan at all of revolution, even when it's for the right cause, because there are casualties involved. And so I think you have to, take that.
Yeah.
So social change done right is this longer process. And so it helps to have decades to look back and see, what worked and what didn't work.
Yep.
And I have that advantage now. I can look back almost 3 decades and see where, where I was naive or where it was actually effective, or, and I can see things that I did that might have contributed to making a positive difference. So musically, I'm kind of in that spot now where I have more than 3 decades. Really, I have my whole life, 50 years to look back and think about not only the artists that I love and the songs that I love and so on, which which again is a huge part of my life, but think a lot about how all of those pieces are connected. And I'm talking specifically about rock music. I don't know much about other kinds of music. These artists are connected to each other. They're connected to what's happening in society at the time. Some of them are having a global sort of influence. Rock and roll itself had a very global influence. And so now you've got 50 years, at least the 50 years that I care about, of rock music having this interesting effect in society. And I absolutely want to dissect it. I just want to take it apart piece by piece and just in a conversation, because I don't have the answers. I don't even know, but to do the digging of sort of saying, well, why was this thing, like this, and who did it, and what was their influence, and was that good or was that bad? Rock music's like everything else too. It's not all good. I mean,
right.
For example, rock, there's a lot of misogyny in rock music, particularly in the 70s. And I think that's worth dissecting. It's not to celebrate it all, of course, but it's to sort of say, well, look, rock music was actually 100% part of the sexual revolution. And for better and for worse. And so it's interesting. I think it's interesting to sort of take that apart and look at it.
Wow. Rock and social change. That's brilliant. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, the fun part about this is the more I get to know our guests, the more I admire them and respect them, and just can't wait to spend even more time with them. And you obviously included. So let's go back to your career arc, if you will. You talked about the marijuana policy. What was the next sort of social change that you'd stepped into after you left that policy group?
So after I left marijuana policy, or what drug policy or criminal justice policy, if you will, broadly, which was about the first decade of my career, I went into higher ed reform. And again, I went in with a sense of because I wasn't a professor, and I didn't have a strong attachment to the higher education industry or anything like that. It was more like looking at something and saying, wow, something's fundamentally wrong. It's certainly how I felt about the drug war at the time. And so I'm looking at higher ed and I'm thinking, here's this really important institution in society, that is absolutely necessary and good, especially in a free society, where the free and open pursuit of ideas is part of what keeps the society free and prosperous. And I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, it's broken. It's absolutely broken.
What year is this?
This was 2004.
Okay. So that narrative had started surfacing in some pockets, but that really wasn't a conventional narrative like it largely is today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I wasn't the first one, for sure. But there were people starting to notice, and so I was an early-ish adopter, but I wasn't on like the leading edge of it. But I saw enough where I was like, something's wrong, on multiple levels. And so I very much, it was an interesting problem. It was a good organization that I'd been recruited to, the Institute for Humane Studies. And it was a leadership role. I was the COO when I started. I was later promoted to the executive director. Um, and it was one of those things I could do and just feel 100% good about it. I just felt like if we're advocating for more openness, more intellectual diversity, more collegiality, more transparency, all these things are unequivocally good.
Yep.
And those things can make higher ed better, and a better higher ed can make the country and the world better. And I got to work with incredibly smart people, way smarter than me, which is definitely how you should surround yourself. And I learned a lot. I spent a lot of time in not just doing the work, but I got to be in an intellectual environment. And that intellectual environment was very focused on social change broadly. So, and not just like, wars or major revolutions or whatnot, but everything from trash collection to the environment to, how do we do these things better? And how do scholars in this case have the freedom and the platform to research and teach these ideas so that we can get to better answers? So I was 100% down with the idea that people who disagree should be able to come together and have those kinds of debates and discussions so that we can advance knowledge. And I was seeing less and less of that.
How long were you in that organization?
I was in that organization for 17 years. So
oh, wow.
It was the bulk of my career.
Okay, yeah.
Really in two different phases, one as the COO and one as the executive director. And I think for many years we were making great progress. And then, around 2016 or so, it was before the election, but it was, the election didn't help. But as things were getting closer, it was becoming clear to me that higher ed was not only were we not making as much progress as I would like, but there was a tidal wave coming from the opposite direction that I didn't even fully understand, in part because that tidal wave was so, there was such an odd sort of anti-free speech component of it, which I'd never seen in my life. My entire life, literally every single person I knew on the right, on the left, in the middle, didn't matter, were pro free speech. That was kind of a given. That was like the one American kind of value that everybody agreed on.
Everybody could.
So, when I saw this kind of anti-free speech kind of tidal wave in higher education, I didn't really even know what to think about it. The very first time I saw it was probably a couple of years earlier in a article that some person wrote in the Harvard Crimson, which is the Harvard, school newspaper. And she was making a case that free speech is sort of a tool of the oppressor, right? A tool of those who are currently in power. And she's making this impassioned case. And I remember reading it and thinking like, wow, I can't believe this got published. And surely no one would take this seriously. Like no one would really start to say, we need to clamp down on free speech because yes, in some cases, powerful people use it. And in a lot of cases, people with no power use it, which is how they gain power. I mean, I had studied social change, so I knew how important free speech was to civil rights and to the gay rights movement and so on. I mean, it's profoundly important that people have the right to express themselves.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, like a year or two later, this argument that I'd seen in the Crimson seems to be everywhere, which was shocking. I mean, I found it was absolutely shocking. And then, of course, you've got the Trump election, which just mixed everything up. The tribalism on both sides, just kind of people came apart, and it became hard to be in the middle. I mean, this is why I admire Barry White so much, because she's, and she calls her magazine Common Sense, and it really is those people in the middle, so to speak, with some common sense and decency that aren't being pulled to one side or the other. They're not part of that polarization. They're not part of that tribalization. They really are still kind of old school liberals, so to speak, right, who believe in freedom, who believe in free speech, who believe in civility. And there were less and less of those people all of a sudden.
That becomes an extreme view in this current environment, which is crazy.
Yeah, to be a moderate, basically, to be kind of a very kind of in a sense a boring person in the middle, and not you're not moderating your views to be milk toast. You're moderating you have moderate views in the sense that you have some sense of subtlety, you have some sense of shades of gray,
Right.
right? Like
Right.
so your position on abortion is not completely ban it, nor is it like we're going to abort babies at 9 months. You have a
Right.
something you're thinking about all of the stages in between and where there is a better answer, not just a compromise,
Right.
but an answer that might be reasonable, right? And that can address the various concerns,
Yeah.
at play and so on. Now, I don't think you can do that on every issue. We're not going to make, I don't know, there's not compromises to murder.
Right. Right.
Um, but even then, there's self-defense,
Right.
and it starts to get murky. And so there's something to be said for being subtle rather than just saying, well, my position is, no murder, no killing people no matter what.
Right.
Well, okay, well that if you mean that literally, then what are you going to do with the person who just entered your home with a gun who's going to, kill your
Right.
family?
Yeah, exactly. Capital
So
punishment, no matter what. Yeah, that's just
right.
silly.
So these exactly, and so all of these positions are silly, frankly, because they lack any degree of subtlety. They lack any degree of rationality or reason, or somewhere between
Nuance.
these. Yeah. And so again, it's not to be compromising for the sake of compromise. It's not to be milk toast. The idea is like to be reasonable and to be subtle and judicious, and all of that just seems to like it's out the window.
Just went out the window, and it's wonderful to hear you with your inside view for as long as you've been viewing it as to how sudden this shift had taken place.
Yeah, very sudden.
It's in the 2014, 15, 16 window is really when this thing really started taking off, which is
Right.
pretty remarkable. What we're all living through right now is a shift with a velocity of change, cultural change, arguably in the wrong direction, polarization, but
Right.
suddenness that isn't that incrementalism you were talking about before. That's really
Well,
something.
that's the reason I mentioned it earlier, because the fundamental danger here is not that one side wins an argument or another on whether it's abortion or for whatever, it doesn't matter what the issue is. Those things shift over time. And frankly, this in history, in the United States at least, those things have over time shifted in the right direction. Not always. There's
Right.
all kinds of imperfection. There's all kinds of things that have stepped back for a moment. But on net over time,
Net, yeah. Yeah.
that shifting, that social evolution, I think has been on net very positive. Um, and so you don't want to lose that process. You don't want to lose the process of a positive social change, even though at moments there are clearly injustices, and there's moments where there are steps backwards. And the real danger of all of this is that we move from an evolutionary to a revolutionary posture. And more so than I think probably any time since the 60s, that's actually a possibility. Now,
If not the reality as we sit here today. Yeah, that's neither of us are probably qualified to make that declarative statement, but it's hard not to come to that conclusion, in my opinion.
yeah, I mean that may be one area where we disagree. So I think it's incredibly uh, I think it's a very difficult and very dangerous time, but I don't believe we've crossed that threshold yet. And I don't think we have to. I don't think it's inevitable. Um, uh, it's when you're in the thick of it with all of the fires burning and all that stuff, it can be pretty dramatic.
Yeah.
And this is how I imagine people might have felt in the mid 60s, during a time of cataclysmic change, certainly anti-war and the civil rights movement and all of that and more. And think about it. People are being assassinated left and right. Like we don't see assassinations very much these days. And so, the shootings at Kent State and all of this stuff, right?
Right. That's a good point.
So I mean, if you're in the middle of that at the time, and when we're in war in Vietnam, and rock music is corrupting people's souls, thanks to Elvis and others, all of that, it's got to feel pretty intense.
Pretty intense. Yeah.
And I kind of feel like that's how we feel in this moment, but we don't have the benefit yet of stepping outside of this moment.
Yeah.
So we're absolutely in that moment. We're in a moment of danger. We're in a moment where things can pivot in the wrong direction, and that worries the hell out of me. But I definitely don't think it's now. I don't think we've already crossed that point of no return, to quote Kansas.
It's interesting because, again, this leads a little bit to your next step of trying to fix higher ed and seeing what you saw evolve into what you're doing now. One of the challenges that I've heard some other really smart people I don't have personal relationships with, but I tend to try and consume their wisdom is that what makes this environment maybe a little more precarious, and I'll grant your point that we were not there yet, but
Right.
we're in a tumultuous period without a doubt, is the concern over whether we actually have the leadership in the positions that are important to actually help us avoid it crossing the chasm.
Right.
And
Leadership.
if not their own agendas, maybe pushing it towards the chasm. And pick
Yeah.
your industry, right? The education and government, of course, business. Where's the business iconic figures that you look up to and admire them? But maybe besides Elon Musk, but even he causes turmoil because of this polarization, even though he is clearly an accomplished man and a heroic entrepreneur, and by anybody's measure. And so,
Yeah.
where is the leadership that people are truly, both camps are willing to set aside and say, I'm willing to support them because of them, in spite of the fact that this other camp likes them. I also get it, right? That's what I think both camps, in large part, have lost the ability to even do. And the leadership in place are pandering to an audience versus taking a courageous leadership stance, irrespective of where the support comes from. That's my editorial, and I apologize, but what?
No. I agree with that. I mean, let me back up by saying that the fundamental mechanism of social change in an evolutionary sense, so not revolutionary, in my opinion, again, and this is something I've actually spent a lot of time on, so I think I probably have a relatively informed opinion. Evolutionary social change is a question of leadership. That's the driving mechanism. And by leadership, I mean sort of within the body of society. If you think of society as an analog to a corpus, a body, for that corpus to evolve, there has to be, right, the thing that's different, right? The mutation, but that's not a great word for it. There has to be the thing that's different, the thing that challenges the status quo. And so in social change, that's very much what we see as the mechanism that's driving that sort of evolution. That somebody somewhere, one, has a different vision for how to do something, two, has the courage to actually pursue that vision, and three, and this gets to where people can have a legacy impact, they build a platform, or they kind of acquire a platform for that message, right? So that's, to me, it's the vision, the courage, and the platform.
Hang on a minute. I'm going to write that down. That's really good. Vision, courage, and platform.
And so we're talking about people. We're talking about leaders, right?
Yeah.
Because you have to be a leader. I mean, to me, that's the definition, right? You see something that others don't necessarily see. You have the courage to pursue it, and then you have the wherewithal to develop a platform so that you can get your message out, and then other people follow you just because they follow. You're leading. You're not necessarily asking them to follow. They just follow, right? Because they see it too, and they're inspired.
Luther King being obviously a poster child for that, but there's
absolutely,
right. Gandhi was wonderful, right? He created his own platform through an
ashram in South Africa. Right. I mean, literally. Yeah. I mean, so you never know where you're going to see it either. You don't know where you're going to see it. If we think of these leaders, it's very hard to predict who these leaders are and where they're going to pop up. So trying to cherry pick the leaders early on, like the same way you might try to cherry pick a stock early on, is just it's hubris.
It's hubris, yeah.
So this is one of the ways that people might try to invest in social change, where I think it's pure hubris.
Yeah.
So this is my bet. I'm gonna put it on this person. That person may be fine. In fact, you should be putting it on people, but you should, at that early stage, you need to put it on a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because you don't know.
You don't know.
You can select for, okay, do they have the right vision? And you can select for, do they have the courage? But the platform piece is probably the hardest.
Yeah.
In many respects, because there's a lot of people who I think have the right ideas and have a fair degree of courage, but for them to be at the right place at the right moment. I mean, if you look at Martin Luther King, he's these Southern churches become the platform, right?
Right.
But it could have easily been a different scenario, and it had been somebody else, I think.
Yeah.
So not that there's nothing special about him. He's incredibly special, and very few people, are that talented as an orator. But
Yep.
but I don't think it was inevitable that it was Martin Luther King. I think it's a combination of factors. And my point is that if you're a legacy investor looking to help social change, I think you find a portfolio of people that you believe in, and you try to help them build a platform.
That's an elegant transition, because I don't want to take too much of your time. We kind of keep these at an hour, so I give ourselves another maybe 15 minutes, but I do want to make that transition, because the art and science of wealth, and then having an impact and leaving a legacy, is really what we're trying to draw out from the wisdom of our guests. And that's where I'd like to evolve this now. Your background is fascinating. I could spend another hour and a half on that. Given what the roles you've played in the various nonprofits where you have spent time with individuals and soliciting their support for your cause, right? Your platform, for lack of a better phrase. Are there any sort of broad lessons you can offer up first? And before, it's delicate to get into individual stories, but on some of the wisdom, some of the do's and don'ts, just kind of when you think in terms of the lessons learned and the degree of interaction, because you've interacted with some, including in the current position at UATX, some pretty significant folks who we see in the headlines a lot. What wisdom can you impart from that and observations, if nothing else? Interacting with them to try and get them on board with the visions you were trying to get them to support, to be part of their legacy.
Yeah. I don't know. That's a tough question. I think one of the challenges that successful people have, and in this case, we're talking about people who are, successful in business or philanthropy or whatnot, is I think they want to apply the things that made them successful in business, then to turn around and to try to apply that to social change. And I think that's a mistake.
Yeah.
And I think it has largely to do with the fact that social change is what they call a wicked problem, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of the wicked problem. The nature of, I forget what the opposite of the wicked problem is. There's a name for it. But the non-wicked problem, the standard problem, is a technical problem that can be solved, right? Like how do we, generate X amount of electricity, or, a light bulb or whatever. There is right. Engineering is a lot about these kinds of problems. These are solvable problems, right? And they may even be solved in more than one way. So there are multiple paths sort of to achieving some solution. Wicked problems don't lend themselves to solutions as much as they lend themselves to progress, which gets back to this idea of evolutionary change. And so there's all kinds of problems that, this gets complicated really fast, because if you apply a top-down kind of problem-solving type of attitude to social change, you're at strong risk of, one, wasting your resources, or worse, potentially making things worse. Because if you treat it like this discrete sort of issue that can be solved if we just kind of engineer it. Let me put it this way, and this is probably the most direct that can be, which is social change is not an engineering problem. At all. It's 100% not an engineering problem.
The opposite.
It's a problem of leadership to get to the earth. The fundamental problem of social change is one of leadership. And therefore, it's not my money. So, if somebody were asking me, like you're asking me, I know what I would do with my own money, and it would be the same thing I would recommend that other people do with their money, which is find the right kind of leaders to invest in, meaning they have the right vision and they have the courage. Don't have it just be one person, because people can fail for different reasons, even people who are doing spectacularly good things. And help them build that platform for success. And you have to have a diversified portfolio. That if I had all the money in the world, that's how I'd invest in social change. I would just let really good people, I would help good people do good things, not trying to pick the winner and not getting too fixed on not pretending like I know what the outcome's going to be. Because that's the point of leadership, is discovery. Those leaders are
Right.
through their actions, they're discovering these paths forward. We have no idea. Nobody, not a single person in India or England in the early 20th century knew that the leadership for freeing India was going to come from a former barrister who lives in South Africa and has an ashram. No one picked that.
You can't predict that. Yeah. Well,
And nor do they understand the mechanisms that come after that. Nobody predicts the Salt March, if you're familiar with the Salt March.
I'm not.
You know, so once Gandhi came back to India, and I'm oversimplifying everything. There's a long history here, but one of the most defining moments after he had returned to India was Gandhi deciding he was going to march to the sea to produce salt, because producing salt was illegal for everyday people to do. Okay. And it was one of the ways that the British maintained control over the Indians. And so this was symbolic, obviously. And so Gandhi starts this he walks, I don't remember how long it was like weeks of sorts, walks to wherever he is to the sea, and what's called the Salt March. And as he was doing it, it was inspiring people along the way. And by the time he arrived there, it is it's a spectacle. I mean, there's so much energy, and there's all these people who followed him, and there's all this media attention, and he goes and he makes salt illegally, and he's arrested. But it's a pivotal moment, because it's a moment of what Dr. Martin Luther King properly understood as nonviolence, right?
Right.
It was nonviolent, non-adherence to the rules to make a point.
Yeah.
But those kinds of moments, whether it's the Salt March or whatever, are very unpredictable. From the point of view of the activists or the philanthropists 5 or 10 years earlier, saying, if we just had a Salt March, maybe that would be the momentum. Right. Nobody knows that, but you do know that Gandhi might be one of those guys worth investing in.
Yeah. Well, just the world that that I operate is in the world of venture capital, and what you just described, diversify, is the mantra that we're obviously advocating for. Don't think you can pick winners.
Yeah,
that's the truth in the human condition.
Right.
Set your systems up to optimize on the outcomes, but make sure that you're deploying your resources in a diversified way, so you can optimize on the outcome you seek to actually materialize. Because you can't pick winners with any degree of consistency that's ever going to end up where you want it to. I mean, it's a wonderful construct, and it's brilliant, and it's obviously ubiquitous across a lot of situations.
Right. But this is the danger from a legacy standpoint, is if you over rely on what has helped you be successful, and then you try to apply it to a wicked problem, you run the risk of not diversifying, or you run the risk of engineering what you think could be a solution when it's going to be radically different than anything that you can imagine, much less engineer. And you're never going to really solve the problem. You're going to make, at best, you're going to make progress. And even solving one problem creates another.
Right? Unintended consequences.
Let's take longevity. Longevity is a problem that we have, up until very recently, actually made a lot of progress on. People want to live longer, and in general, they have over the course of history, certainly in modern history. But longevity itself creates another set of problems, right? Cancer and other things are related to longevity, because now we live long enough to get some of these problems that we didn't have before.
That's right.
And that's why it's called a wicked problem, because it's all bundled together in a highly complicated way where you can't engineer a solution.
Right.
But have we made progress? Absolutely, right? We've made progress with longevity. We've made progress with birth rates, all kinds of stuff. The world's absolutely, unequivocally a better place than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. I think to not see that would be to be blind.
Yep.
The problem is the world's still full of problems, and it will be 100 years from now. So we've got to focus on making progress and not focus on these absolutes. And here it is again, sort of absolutism showing up And that becomes the problem. It's this hubris around the, black and white, and around absolute, my side or the other side, or this solution. It's all that hubris that gets us every time.
And that's called human beings, right?
Well, exactly. That's the problem. And this may be the fatal flaw, right? If there's a code, a fatal code within human beings, it's arrogance, it's hubris.
Well, I do bundle it as a relatively spiritual person. I bundle it into the 7 deadly sins, right?
Right.
Those things creep in, and they're like candy or alcohol. You get drawn to them, and you feel good for in a transactional way, or junk food or whatever else, right?
Right.
But ultimately, the reason you did that is, and then the hangover, the unintended consequences, even it's coming, but you still deny it, is they're constant. And whether it's any of the 7, or typically a combination, are what does have an outsized influence on short-term decision making.
Right.
And time is the component you're talking about, is evolution and progress. It's the process that matters, not some adherence to some rigid outcome that, by God, you're going to force an engineer.
Exactly. It is the process that matters. There's a name for this process. It's called the discovery process. We discover over time better answers.
Yep.
We do, whether that's social or economic or technical. But it is a process, and that process relies 100%. That process relies on the free and open exploration of ideas, which takes us full circle back to my current work.
Exactly.
You cannot have the discovery process unless people are free to explore and debate and discuss ideas.
And you teach the young people that are going to hopefully be the problem solvers in 5 and 10 and 20 years from now how to think, not what to think, which is, I think, what you're saying happened at Harvard Crimson. We'll call that the shot across the bow that started the whole thing. I don't know if it's true or not, but
I don't know if it is either. I just know it was my experience.
Yeah. And that was basically where we had this in the recent past, the higher education trying to indoctrinate kids on what to think versus how to think. And that's a legit crisis. I think that is a legit crisis.
Right. It takes us back to the earlier point, which is if you're teaching what to think rather than how to think. So how to think is a set of tools, analytical tools, right? That help you with this process of discovery.
To discover. That's right. For discovery.
So that is a deeply humble thing, because the discovery process assumes, and it's founded on the fact that you do not know.
You do not know. That's right.
And you have to kind of admit you don't know. That's why you're taking the process. That's why you're taking that path. The opposite, of course, is you're teaching people what to think. And in order to teach them what to think, you have to know what the truth is. And that's the foundation you're standing on. You're standing on a foundation of truth. Yeah. I know what the truth is. Right. I'm going to impart it to you. Look, that's not such a hard thing to do when you're talking about math or something that people can look at and replicate, right? So in the hard sciences, and there's still a lot for us to discover there, but even in physics, we don't know everything, but we know enough where we can stand on firm ground with certain things that we think of as truth. And those truths are remarkably consistent and can be replicated by anybody else under the same circumstances.
Right. That's right.
That is fundamentally different than these highly complex, abstract things, where we, like God or the weather or things that are profoundly complex, where we say we have the truth.
Right.
We may have evidence, we may have confidence, we might have reason, we have all kinds of things, but we don't have the truth.
The truth.
And so it's a profoundly arrogant position to take, even if you're doing it for the best of reasons, even if you're trying to, help people who deserve and need help, or people that are being exploited. Of course, nobody wants any of those things. But all of a sudden pretending like you have the truth around that, and then you're going to just impart it, and you shut down anything that's not the truth. That's fundamentalism, right? I think of it as a secular fundamentalism. It's not the fundamentalism we typically relate to religions. It's a kind of fundamentalism. It's a scientism is what they call it, right? Like, it's not real science, but it's like our science, and it's the truth. That's why we call it science. This this idea of science is real may be the most arrogant and dangerous idea
Well,
that's part of our current culture. Thinking about this, science is not an outcome.
no, it's a process.
Science is a process.
It's a process.
It's the discovery process. So
It's
the discovery process is real,
yeah.
but when people are saying science is real, they're saying my conclusion using this process is the truth.
The truth.
And so they're saying they know that.
Well,
and I don't care who you are. It's not conservative, liberal, anything. Anybody that says that is foolhardy.
You know the headline that I'm thinking of, and I don't know if you're using it as your example, but I certainly have to put it out there, is when Fauci says, "I am science."
Anybody. It doesn't. Right. Exactly. And so, like, I never wade into these culture wars because this is all humans, right? This is the kind of hubris that has been that kind of downfall of humans in one form or another, in one ideology or another for all of human history.
All of human history.
And so that is the thing, I guess, taking it full circle back to my career, in some ways, that's the thing that I think I'm working against, or working to try to somehow make a difference. Like, could we just approach these things with some self-awareness that there's humility in order? Can we just appreciate how much we don't know? Yeah. More recently, speaking of podcasts, one of my ideas, which again I may never pursue, but I'm very close to thinking about I don't know if it'd be a podcast or a blog or something, but it would be called Predictable. And the idea of predictable would be like kind of making fun of all the times people thought they could predict the future and didn't. Because it's like that this is one of the ways this manifests constantly, is people keep saying they know what the future is,
right? And
it's like, again, it's a wicked problem. Like, I can tell you that for example, I can tell you that I don't think we've crossed the threshold for the sort of societal breakdown that we might be in danger of, but I don't know it. Yeah. I'm not going to predict it. Yeah. And so these people who come out and they kind of assert this is what's going to happen. Look, we can't get actuarial tables right. And there's a lot of data.
That's right.
So let's have some humility about really complex forces like human societies.
Yeah, let's have some humility. So, Chad, I could do this for hours.
You're like the best conversation partner, Joe. So you got me going. I was just like, screw it. Joe invited this. He's just going to get the full Monty.
Oh. This is the sort of discourse, and I will put in a plug. I know that's not your job and why you're here, but the University of Austin, that is its aspiration, is to create a higher education environment that allows for this level of discourse. And I'll speak of over the summer as the organization is taking shape and the fundraising is way ahead of schedule. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're doing well. We're raising money.
You're raising money. You've got a piece of land just east of Austin here that's been designated and donated, correct?
Yeah, it's still in process, but yes, we have an MOU, if you will, on some.
There we go.
So
land, there's a lot of tangibility taking shape, and it's fun for you to be able to go full circle and end up back in Austin, working on something that is for good. I think that's it's an elegant arc. You're clearly a success, Chad. At so many levels. I actually can tell you, I listened to some of his music recently, and I had to look over at him and think, that can't be you because this shit's good.
Yeah, it's holding up okay. I like most of it still.
Your humility is clear. Your intellectual humility and your creative humility is clear. But I can tell you, you are a talented person on multiple fronts, and it's a privilege to call you a friend. And I mean that sincerely. So,
thank you, Joe.
Producer Nick, say hello again, Nick. He is our elegant producer. We are developing a remarkable following of folks that are really interested in this content, this long form conversation. We obviously are not recreating that format. We're just learning from those that are doing it so well, and the market has responded so well to just have some thoughtful discourse so people can actually learn something from folks that aren't selling something. And you did such a wonderful job, Chad, to open up so many thoughts. And well, again, I can't thank you enough. And for the folks, another treat from the Rolodex and the audience of Steffi and I that can offer some wisdom on things to help people understand the challenges of having wealth and excess riches, so they can be more efficient at having an impact and leaving a legacy. That's our goal. Thank you, Chad.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you for watching and listening to the Art and Science of Wealth podcast, Having an Impact, Leaving a Legacy. Edited and produced by Nicholas Peck.